She's losing it, Darren. The house, the savings, everything. We need to move before she signs it all away to some charity. I was sitting in my kitchen in Kelowna when I heard my daughter say those words. She didn't know I was home. She thought I'd gone to my Tuesday afternoon cardiac rehab at the Okanagan Health Center, the same appointment I'd kept every week for 8 months since my bypass surgery. She thought wrong. I'd turned back at the end of the driveway because I forgot my water bottle. I know, 67 years old and I still can't remember a water bottle. I came in through the side door, the one that doesn't make noise, and I heard her voice from the living room. Clear as anything. That clipped, efficient tone she uses on the phone with her husband. The one that means she's already decided what's going to happen. I stood in the hallway and I listened, and I understood, in the way you understand things you've been half knowing for a long time, that everything I'd suspected over the past 3 months was true. My name is Kenneth Ashworth. I spent 32 years with the British Columbia Provincial Court, the last 14 as a provincial court judge in the Okanagan region. I've heard thousands of cases. Fraud, family disputes, elder abuse, inheritance contests. I've looked at evidence and rendered verdicts that changed people's lives. I thought that experience made me immune to being played. I was wrong about that too. My daughter's name is Sandra. She's 41. She married a man named Darren Holt 8 years ago. He's in commercial real estate in Kelowna, the kind of man who wears expensive watches and talks about markets at dinner. I never warmed to him. Sandra knows this. She's known it since the wedding, when I shook his hand and felt nothing in it. My wife Eleanor passed away 4 years ago. Breast cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. After she died, Sandra started coming around more. At first I thought it was grief, both of ours, the way loss can pull people back together. She'd come for Sunday dinners, bring flowers, ask how I was sleeping. It felt like care. Looking back, I think it was inventory. Eleanor and I had done well for ourselves. The house in Kelowna, a property in the South Okanagan we'd bought in 2003 that had tripled in value, retirement savings, a modest investment portfolio, nothing extravagant, just the accumulated result of 2 people who worked hard and lived carefully for 40 years. Combined value, somewhere north of $2 million. Enough to be worth scheming over, apparently. The cardiac surgery changed things. I came home from Vancouver General in February, thinner than I'd been since my 30s, slow on the stairs, dependent in ways I'd never been in my life. Sandra offered to stay for a few weeks. I said yes. Darren came on weekends. They were attentive, helpful. Sandra managed my medications, drove me to appointments, cooked meals I didn't have the energy to argue about. And she started, very gently, very gradually, talking about my affairs. Just to make sure everything is in order, Dad. You know, at your age, after the surgery, it makes sense to review things. Have you thought about updating your will? Have you talked to your financial advisor lately? You know what happens if something happens suddenly and things aren't organized. I told her I had a will. I told her it was current. I told her I had a lawyer and a financial advisor I trusted and that things were organized. She'd smile and drop it, then bring it up again 2 weeks later from a slightly different angle. In March, she introduced me to a man named Dennis Farrow. Sandra said he was a financial planner who specialized in estate transitions for seniors. He came to the house in a good suit, very polished, talked about tax efficiency and protecting assets from probate and making sure my wishes were properly documented. He suggested a new structure for my assets, something involving a family trust with Sandra as the trustee. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think he was legitimate, but I smiled, took his card, and made a note of his name. That was in March. By April, I'd had him checked out. Dennis Farrow had a real financial planning certification, but he also had a complaint filed with the BC Securities Commission 2 years earlier, never fully resolved, involving misappropriation of funds from an elderly client in Penticton. The complaint was settled privately. No criminal charges, just a quiet settlement and a client who probably didn't know what had happened to her money. I filed that away. I also, in April, had a conversation with my actual lawyer, Victor Callahan. I'd known Victor for 25 years. I asked him to draw up a new will. I asked him to add something specific, a provision that if I were to die within 18 months of signing any major asset transfer, the transfer would be subject to automatic review for undue influence. I asked him to keep the will entirely confidential until my death, or until I authorized its release. Victor looked at me for a long moment and said, "You think something's coming, don't you?" I said I didn't know, but I wanted to be ready. I also, in late April, installed cameras in my home. Not hidden exactly, not tucked into smoke detectors like spy films. Just small Wi-Fi-enabled cameras I mounted in the living room, the kitchen, and the hallway near my home office. The kind you can buy at any Canadian Tire for under $100. I tested them, linked them to my phone, and made sure they recorded continuously to a cloud server. Sandra noticed them in May. She asked what they were. I told her my doctor had suggested a home monitoring system in case I had a cardiac episode alone. She accepted this. Darren, when he visited that weekend, looked at them longer than Sandra had. But neither of them said anything more about it. The conversation I overheard in June was not the first suspicious thing. It was the clearest. I stood in my hallway and I listened to my daughter tell her husband that they needed to move before I signed my assets to charity. I heard Darren say that the cardiac thing had bought them time, but they needed to accelerate. I heard Sandra say she'd already talked to Farrow, and that there was a way to establish a power of attorney if they could document cognitive decline. Cognitive decline. I am 67 years old. I had a heart procedure, not a stroke. My mind is the same mind that sat on a provincial court bench for over 3 decades. But I stood in my hallway and I breathed very slowly, and I let them finish their conversation, and then I went quietly back out the side door and drove to my cardiac rehab appointment. I sat through the exercise session and the group discussion and the drive home thinking about evidence. Not about betrayal, not yet. About what I had and what I still needed. What I had, the camera footage of that conversation, the information about Dennis Farrow, Victor's sealed will with the undue influence provision, a clear and documented pattern of behavior going back 4 months. What I needed, more rope. In July, I let Sandra take me to a new appointment, a geriatric assessment clinic she'd found in Kelowna. For peace of mind, Dad, just to have a baseline, the doctor who assessed me, a brisk woman named Dr. Hannah Kovacs, administered a standard cognitive battery. I scored in the 97th percentile for my age group. Dr. Kovacs told me afterward, with what I can only describe as professional amusement, that she saw very little of his kind of referral come through with results like mine. I asked her to make sure the report was thorough and that it noted the date and the referral source. She looked at me a moment, then she nodded and said she'd make sure it was complete. I thanked her and went home and said nothing to Sandra about the results. Sandra asked me about the assessment that evening. I told her the doctor said things looked fine but wanted to do a follow-up in 3 months. Sandra nodded sympathetically. Darren, sitting across the dinner table, said nothing, but I watched his jaw tighten just slightly. The real move came in August. Sandra told me she'd been thinking, and that she was worried about the South Okanagan property. The taxes were going up, the maintenance was a lot for one person to manage, and had I considered whether it made sense to transfer it now, while she could help manage the transition, rather than dealing with it through probate later. Darren had a colleague in property management who could handle the details. I said that was an interesting idea. I said I'd been thinking similarly, actually, that the whole estate felt complicated to manage on my own, that I was starting to wonder whether a family trust structure might make sense after all. Sandra looked at me with something that took her a moment to arrange into the right expression. She settled on relieved. She said she was glad I was being practical about it, that she just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I said I wanted to meet with Farrow again, that I had some questions. We met at my house the following week. I let Farrow walk me through the proposed structure in detail. A family trust with Sandra as primary trustee and Darren as secondary. The Okanagan property transferred in. Oversight minimal because I would remain a beneficiary and would retain, he assured me, full quality of life. I asked questions. I let him answer. I asked about the specific mechanisms by which I might reclaim control if I changed my mind later. He gave me an answer that sounded reassuring and was on close examination almost meaningless. I nodded like I found it satisfying. At no point did I mention that I'd already consulted Victor about this structure, and that Victor had told me flatly it was designed to benefit the trustees, not the beneficiary, and that the protections Farrow described did not actually appear in the draft documents he'd submitted. The cameras were running. In September, Sandra brought me a set of documents to sign. She said Farrow had finalized everything. She set them on the kitchen table with a pen, very casually, as if signing them were the obvious next step. I picked them up and said I wanted to read them tonight and sign tomorrow. She said, of course, take your time. That night I photographed every page and sent them to Victor. Victor called me the next morning. His voice was careful. Kenneth, he said, do not sign these. The power of attorney clause gives Sandra and Darren joint authority over medical and financial decisions effective immediately upon signing. The trust structure transfers beneficial ownership of the property within 90 days. There's a clause about capacity reassessment that effectively allows them to trigger a second assessment using a provider of their choosing. He paused. This is a sophisticated document. Someone who knows estate law put this together. I told him I wasn't planning to sign. I also told him it was time to call the RCMP. What followed was not quick. It is never quick. The Kelowna RCMP Economic Crimes Unit took my information, reviewed my evidence, brought in a forensic accountant to assess the documents. They contacted the BC Securities Commission about Farrow's prior complaint. They subpoenaed phone records. In November, they arrested Dennis Farrow on fraud charges. Sandra and Darren were arrested the same morning. Darren at his office on Water Street, Sandra at our house where she had come, I learned later, with a second set of documents she'd planned to present as a corrected version that I'd already signed. I was not home when they arrested her. I was at Victor's office drinking terrible instant coffee and waiting for my phone to ring. It rang at 9:47 in the morning. It was the detective I'd been working with, a patient, thorough man named Sergeant Leclerc. They have them, he said. All three. I put the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet of Victor's office. Outside, it was a cold November morning in Kelowna. The last of the leaves were gone. The lake was that flat, grey color it gets in autumn when the tourists are all back wherever they came from, and the city settles into itself. I watched it through the window and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief. Victor refilled my terrible coffee without asking. The preliminary hearings took place over the winter. I appeared twice to give evidence. Sitting across from Sandra in a courtroom is a particular kind of strange that I cannot fully describe. She's my daughter. I changed her diapers. I coached her soccer team when she was 9. I taught her to drive in an empty parking lot in West Kelowna on a Sunday morning when she was 16, and she reversed into a concrete barrier and cried. And I told her it was fine, that learning things meant sometimes you hit the barriers. I meant that kindly then. I'm not sure what I mean by it now. Darren, I found easier to look at. He had the expression men like him get when the thing they thought was impenetrable turns out not to be. Not remorse. Recalculation. The Crown prosecutor's name was Patricia Song. She was thorough and unhurried, and had the quality I've always respected most in lawyers, which is the ability to make complex things clear without making them simple. She walked the court through the evidence methodically. The Farrow connection and his prior history with the Securities Commission. The phone record showing 17 calls between Sandra and Farrow before Farrow ever visited my house, contradicting Sandra's claim that she'd found him through a referral. The camera footage from my living room showing Sandra and Darren discussing how to handle the assessment results before Sandra had told me about the assessment at all. The documents Victor had reviewed. The gap between what Farrow had told me in person and what the documents actually said. The defense made the arguments defenses always make in these cases, that Sandra was a concerned daughter acting in good faith, that the documents, while perhaps imperfect, reflected a genuine attempt to protect her father's interests, that Darren had limited involvement, that Farrow was a professional third party whose credentials had been verified. Song's rebuttal was patient and devastating. If this was protective, she said to the court, you'd expect to find some evidence that Mr. Ashworth's interests were actually protected. What we find instead is a power of attorney that removes his ability to reverse the arrangement, a trust structure that benefits the trustees, and an assessment referral timed to coincide with the document signing. This is not protection, this is appropriation. I was called to the stand again for cross-examination by Sandra's defense lawyer, a man named Kowalski who was skilled but working with very little. He tried. He suggested I had been hostile to Darren from the beginning and that the whole investigation was motivated by personal dislike. He suggested my cognitive assessment results, while positive, didn't preclude the possibility that my judgment had been influenced by grief over my wife. He suggested I had conducted a campaign of surveillance against my own daughter. I looked at him steadily when he said that. I said, I installed cameras in my own home after I had reason to believe my assets were being targeted. I sought a legal opinion on documents I was being pressured to sign. I reported my concerns to the RCMP when I had sufficient evidence. I did not surveil my daughter. I protected myself. And I would suggest there is a significant difference between those two things. He had no further questions. The verdicts came on a Thursday in late March, a bright, cold morning when the snow was still on the mountains above the city. I sat in the front row with Victor beside me. Sandra and Darren were at the defense table. Farrow was being tried separately and would face his own verdict the following month. The judge, a woman I did not know personally but had appeared before twice in my career, read the verdicts in the same even tone I'd used myself for 32 years. Fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, attempted identity theft for the falsified signing clause. Sandra, guilty on all counts. Darren, guilty on fraud and conspiracy. Farrow, at his separate trial 3 weeks later, guilty on fraud, guilty on breach of fiduciary duty, guilty on a third count related to his earlier Penticton client, whose case had been reopened as part of this investigation. Sentencing was in June. Patricia Sung asked for the maximum. The defense asked for community supervision, given Sandra's lack of prior record and her family circumstances. The judge, to her credit, was not moved by family circumstances given the nature of the crime. Financial exploitation of a parent, she said, is not a lesser offense because of the relationship. It is, if anything, a more serious one, because it involves a betrayal of the most fundamental trust. Sandra received 18 months in a federal correctional facility and 3 years probation. Darren received 22 months, the longest sentence reflecting his role in coordinating the financial structure and his prior contact with Farrow. Restitution was ordered. Legal fees, the cost of the RCMP investigation that I'd been partially liable for, and a further amount to cover the geriatric assessment costs that Sandra had arranged under false pretenses. Darren's lawyer noted his client had limited liquid assets. The judge noted that his interest in 2 commercial properties on Harvey Avenue in Kelowna would address that. I did not go to Sandra after the sentencing. I thought about it. Victor thought I shouldn't. I agreed with him, though not entirely for the reasons he gave. He thought it would be too hard. I thought it would be too easy to say something I hadn't earned the right to say yet. What do you say to your daughter after that? What words exist for that particular shape of loss? Eleanor would have known. She always knew what to say in the impossible moments. She'd have stood in that courthouse hallway and found words that were honest and kind at the same time, which is the hardest combination. I'm not as good at that as she was. I drove home alone and sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. I put the house up for sale in August, not because I had to, because the house had become something it wasn't supposed to be, full of a different kind of memory than the one Eleanor and I had made in it together. I wanted a clean slate. The word clean felt important. It sold for $1.3 million in September to a young family from Calgary who were relocating for work. I signed the papers in Victor's office, same as I'd signed everything that year in Victor's office, and thanked him for everything. He shook his head and said he'd never had a file quite like it. I told him I hoped he wouldn't have another. I bought a small place in Victoria, a 2-bedroom near the water in James Bay, close enough to walk to the inner harbor in the mornings, which I've been doing when the weather allows. The cardiac rehab program at Royal Jubilee Hospital accepted my transfer without any fuss. My new cardiologist, a practical woman who has the excellent quality of telling me exactly what she thinks, says my heart is doing better than the numbers suggested it would 8 months ago. She says I should keep walking and reduce my stress. I told her I was working on the second part. The money from the Kelowna house and the Okanagan property, after taxes and fees and the legal costs of the past year, came to something over $1.5 million. I kept enough to live on without worrying. The rest I put to three uses: a substantial donation to CNPEA, the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, which does the quiet, difficult work of helping older Canadians who are being taken advantage of by people who should know better. A donation to the BC Law Foundation's Legal Aid program for seniors needing estate planning assistance, and an endowment at UVic's Faculty of Law for a student award in elder law and vulnerable adult protections. Sandra would understand, if she thought about it, that this was not accidental. Every dollar she'd wanted is now being used to make sure what happened to me happens to fewer people. That was deliberate. I won't apologize for it. I've started writing. Not a memoir, not yet. Notes, mostly. Things I learned. What the warning signs looked like in retrospect and how easy they were to rationalize in the moment, because the person presenting them was someone I loved. How trust and familiarity are the specific tools that make this kind of exploitation possible. How many people it happens to who don't have a law career's worth of evidentiary instincts to fall back on. I don't know if it will become anything. But writing it down feels necessary. Witness to my own experience. Something like that. Most mornings now I walk to the harbor and back. There's a bench near the water where I've developed the habit of sitting for a few minutes before I turn around. You can see the Olympic Mountains across the strait on clear days, this improbable blue distance that makes the world feel larger than it usually does. I think about Eleanor sometimes on that bench, about what she'd say, about the marriage we had for 39 years, which was a genuinely good one, which is not a thing to take for granted. About the grandmother she never got to be. About the grandmother Sandra never got to be, not yet, and maybe not for a while. I don't think about the money. The money was always just the accumulated shape of the years. It was never the point. I think about the girl Sandra was before she became whoever she is now. The girl who cried in that parking lot in West Kelowna when she reversed into the concrete barrier, and how I told her that learning things sometimes meant hitting the barriers. I still believe that. I just didn't know then that some of the barriers would be me, or that she'd be the one driving. 18 months is not a long time, and it is not a short time. I don't know who she'll be when she comes out. I don't know who I'll be by then either. I'm 67. I've had heart surgery. I've just spent a year watching my own daughter try to take everything I built with her mother. I'm not the same person I was before any of that, but I am still here. The mountains across the strait are still there on clear mornings. The coffee from the place on Menzies Street is reliably good. The walking helps. The writing helps. The knowledge that I saw it coming, that I prepared, that I protected what mattered, that I made sure her choices had consequences, that helps too. One thing at a time. That's enough for now. There's a bench near the water in James Bay where I sit most mornings, and I've been thinking lately about what it actually takes to survive something like this. Not physically. Emotionally. The way you have to hold two true things at once, that your daughter tried to take everything you built with the woman you loved for 39 years, and that the same daughter once cried in a parking lot because she scraped a concrete barrier and you told her it was fine. Both of those things are real. I've stopped trying to make one cancel out the other. What I keep coming back to is the question of character. Not hers, mine. Because when I stood in that hallway and heard Sandra's voice, I had a choice about what kind of person I was going to be in the months that followed. I could have confronted her immediately, out of hurt and anger, and probably destroyed any chance of building a case. I could have told myself I was misunderstanding something, because it's easier to doubt your own ears than to accept what they're telling you. I could have done what a lot of people in that position do, which is nothing, because nothing is less painful in the short term. I didn't do any of those things. Not because I'm exceptional, because 32 years on the bench taught me that the truth doesn't protect itself. You have to protect it. You have to be methodical and patient and honest enough to look at evidence clearly, even when the evidence is about someone you love. That kind of clarity isn't cold. It's the most demanding thing I know. It requires you to be genuinely honest with yourself about what's in front of you, which most of us spend a great deal of energy avoiding. Dennis Farrow and Darren understood one thing about people, that we extend trust to those we're closest to long past the point where the trust has been earned. They built the entire scheme on that. Sandra brought Farrow to my kitchen because she knew I'd be slower to scrutinize someone she vouched for. Darren structured the documents through legal language specifically designed to be difficult to pass. They were counting on my love for my daughter to make me careless, and in another version of this story, it would have worked. What I want people to take from this, if there's anything to take, is that protecting yourself is not a betrayal of love. I loved Sandra when I installed those cameras. I loved her when I photographed those documents and sent them to Victor. I loved her when I called Sergeant Leclerc. Love without clear-eyed judgment isn't protection. It's just exposure. And then there's the question of what you do after. Because getting through something like this takes more than intelligence and preparation. It takes the willingness to keep going on the mornings when the lake is gray and the house feels too quiet and you're aware in your whole body that the family you thought you had is not the family you actually had. Those mornings happen. They still happen. The walking helps. The writing helps. Making sure the money goes somewhere useful instead of sitting as a monument to a grief I didn't choose, that helps too. I'm 67. I had heart surgery. I watched my daughter get handcuffed. I moved to a new city and I'm starting over with a clean conscience and a good cardiologist and a bench by the water where the mountains are visible on clear days. That's enough. It really is.